Garry Adelman, American Battlefield Trust, here with Chris from Vlogging Through History, and he's asked me to talk about some of my favorite stuff, so let's do this, okay? We're on the battlefield of Antietam, but how in this obscure woodlot do you end up with soldiers from New York, Minnesota, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Louisiana, Virginia, South Carolina, and elsewhere? Well, let's talk about that, because we are at Antietam, and some of you watching might say, Antietam, where does that fit in? And then it's easy to get confused. Chickamauga, Winchester, Malvern Hill, Perryville, how does it all fit together? Well, at least we're in the East now, and the fighting in the East really boils down to just 5 grand movements. They started around Manassas, Virginia. The Confederates win, but ultimately the Union moves down toward Richmond. That results in the Peninsula Campaign in the 7 days. Confederates under Robert E. Lee do well there. He moves north and strikes out. That will come all the way up here to Antietam. The Confederates will be repulsed there. Sorry to spoil the end for you for this video series here. And then the fight will move back down toward Fredericksburg, where the Confederates win there, and at Chancellorsville. So the Confederates, feeling good, move north toward Gettysburg. And after Gettysburg, the toll in the east sort of goes inevitably south toward Richmond and Petersburg, where near there, the Confederates will surrender. And all of these battles in the east, including those in the Shenandoah Valley, really fit into those 5 grand movements. Now, 2 of those movements really concern us today, and that is when George McClellan goes and floats this huge army, more than 100,000 soldiers, out to Chesapeake Bay, and they try to advance up the peninsula formed by the York and the James River. They're going to try to go on Richmond there. There's a battle called Seven Pines there that only really results in Lee getting put in command, and then Lee launches what will be known as the 7 Days Battles. You've heard of these, primarily Beaver Dam Creek and Gaines's Mill, Savage Station, Glendale, or Fraser's Farm, and Malvern Hill. Lee effectively moves or pushes the Union Army under McClellan away, so Lee's feeling good. He decides to move northward. That results in the Battle of Cedar Mountain in Virginia, August of 1862. That's a close call with part of his army, but then he continues north. That results in the Battle of Second Manassas, or the Second Battle of Bull Run. Lee does well at that battle, 4 times larger than the first, and then we'll sort of have an inconclusive engagement at a place called Chantilly. After Chantilly, Lee's army has been ragged. They've been fighting through the 7 days and at Cedar Mountain and Second Bull Run, or Second Manassas, and Lee decides he's going to move further northward. This is the time with Braxton Bragg moving to the north in Kentucky, farther west from here. This is the time to make this done. Maybe France and England will join on our side if only we can march with impunity into the north. And Lee marches through this part of Maryland thinking that Marylanders, Southern friendly Marylanders, are going to rise up to the cause over here. He comes up with a great plan to do it, except he probably marches through the wrong part of Maryland. If he was looking for Southern sympathizers, he's going to march them into the north without a lot of respect for his opponent. Now again, George McClellan. He's going to split his army up. Famously, you know, some of his orders are found near Frederick, Maryland, showing that his army is going to be dangerously split. We could argue about whether or not the Union moved as quickly as they should have, more quickly than they should have, or otherwise, but the Union is moving uncharacteristically quickly at this point, and they start to push in this direction. There's a terrible battle at South Mountain, 4,500 casualties. 2 years earlier, that would have been the bloodiest battle ever fought in American history. But they fight at 4 mountain passes of South Mountain. The Southerners fall back. Southerners get some good news with the capitulation of Harper's Ferry, where they have the largest capture of Union soldiers during the entire war. Harper's Ferry falls, but now comes the Union juggernaut, 60, 70, 80,000 Union soldiers coming toward Sharpsburg, Maryland here. And Robert E. Lee has got the Potomac River to his back. Okay, it's only 1 mile in that direction. It's 5 miles in the other. But either way, it's a big swollen river to his back. And here comes the large Union army here. And Robert E. Lee thinks he can still salvage this campaign. And that sets up the Battle of Antietam.
After Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in 1861, militia companies began to form across the entire state of Texas. Initially, the Confederate government wanted Texas militia to stay in Texas in order to provide defense in that frontier part of the Confederacy. But 10 companies of Texas militia marched to Richmond without authorization. Those companies formed what became the nucleus of the 1st Texas Infantry Regiment. By October of 1861, the regiment was joined with several others to become the Texas Brigade. The Texas Brigade really began to make a name for itself under a Kentuckian who had adopted Texas, John Bell Hood. Carrying 1853 Enfield rifles, the brigade fought savagely on the peninsula and began to operate as one of the shock troop brigades for the Army of Northern Virginia. By the time they arrived here in Sharpsburg, the 1st Texas Infantry had just 226 men in their ranks. They were under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Philip Work. The Texas Brigade now under the command of William Wofford, who in turn reported to John Bell Hood, who commanded the division. Hood's division arrived here near Sharpsburg on the 15th of September. And a lot of people don't realize that there was actually a fair bit of fighting that took place here between Union and Confederate forces on the 16th. And the Texas Brigade was involved in some of that fighting. The PA Bucktails, who actually carried Sharp's breech-loading rifles, actually came from the north and engaged in a pretty hot skirmish with the 1st Texas and others. Eventually, the Bucktails were driven back through the woods. Their colonel was killed in the action on the 16th. And the Texas boys received permission to fall back to the rear, back to the Dunker Church, which you can't see, but is kind of along that next ridgeline behind me there. They hadn't eaten for a while, and so they asked General Jackson for permission to get some rations. Around 9 p.m. on the night of the 16th, it began to rain, and it rained for a number of hours into the night. The men waited, and they waited, and they waited, and they finally got their rations at about 4 o'clock in the morning. Having fought on the night of the 16th, having endured the rain, and now staying up half the night waiting for rations, they finally got them. They started cooking their rations. They'd put them on ramrods and stick them in the fire. And just as they sat down to start to eat, the opening artillery bombardment began that signaled Hooker's attack on the morning of September 17th. It was around 7 a.m. when the men of the 1st Texas were told back here somewhere in these woods around the Dunker Church that they needed to line up and form for battle. They were going to be part of the counterattack because by this time Hooker's advance had pushed through the cornfield in the distance and driven the Confederates off of this ridge behind me, and they were starting to fall back, and so reinforcements were desperately needed. And Hood's division, who were still upset about the fact that they hadn't gotten to eat, were none too happy about having to go into battle, but they began to form up. And you have to understand that while this is going on, there's already been fighting for at least an hour back there. There's this tremendous artillery duel going on. Stephen Dill Lee has something like 20 guns on this hill here. There are at least 15 guns under Pelham up on Nicodemus Heights in that direction. Beyond the Antietam Creek in that direction, there are probably 20 long-range, like 20-pounder Parrots, things like that, that are firing from the Union position down onto the Confederates. And then there are dozens of guns in multiple batteries under Hooker that are firing from the north. And so there's artillery and small arms fire and noise and smoke. And you've got men who haven't slept and haven't eaten. It's a recipe for disaster on both sides. And that's kind of what ends up happening. So the men form up and I'll head over a little further across to give you a sense of exactly where they were and what happened next. The men came out of the woods. This is the Hagerstown Turnpike, and they actually lined up. The Hampton Legion would have been on the left, right along this road here. And then from left to right, the Texas Brigade lined up with the 1st Texas being in the center of the 5 regiments. So they would have been a little further over this way. The commander of the 1st Texas said they didn't even have to give a command to attack, because as soon as everybody was into position, they began to charge at the enemy and drive them back. Now, on the receiving end of that charge were elements of what we know today as the Iron Brigade, including the 6th Wisconsin. The 6th Wisconsin had already been in combat for a while at this point. They were running low on ammunition. They were exhausted. And Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin said that when the Texas Brigade charged into them, it was like a scythe cutting through at harvest time. You can just picture that in your mind. For a commander to say that about what happened to his own men, how devastating that attack must have been. And the men in blue were driven back through the cornfield. The men of the 2nd and 6th Wisconsin fell back. They ran back as quickly as they could through the cornfield. They had exhausted their ammunition. They had been torn to shreds. And the furious attack by the 1st Texas and the other members of their brigade was more than they could stand. We're now on the north end of the cornfield. There's a fence here, and this fence is pretty important. This is the D.R. Miller farm. It was Miller's cornfield here. The 1st Texas, as they pushed through the men of the Iron Brigade, and as they drove through the cornfield, obviously, as you can see the corn, it's really difficult to understand what's going on more than a few feet around you. And that's what happened with the 1st Texas. As they charged, they didn't realize that they were significantly out in front of the other members of their brigade. In fact, by the time they got to about 30 yards from this fence in the cornfield, they were about 150 yards ahead of the rest of the brigade. And here, lined up along this fence, were 2 fresh brigades under George Gordon Meade. The Texas boys got, as I said, about 30 yards away when Meade's brigades unleashed just a crippling volley on the men of Texas. The colors went down. About a dozen men around the colors went down. Within a few more shots, there were very few men left standing. And that's before we even take into account Hooker's artillery that was massed along the ridge behind us there. And so you can just imagine, the men are angry. They haven't eaten. They're winning. They push forward. They feel like they're really doing something incredible. And then just in a moment, their entire line melts away. When it was all said and done, there was very little left of the 1st Texas. There was 1 man fit for duty from Company A, 2 from Company C, 3 from Company E. There was no more Company F. Over 80% of the men of the 1st Texas fell in maybe an hour or so of fighting. It was the single greatest one-day loss for any unit in the entire American Civil War. The 12th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry was raised in the spring of 1861 in the Boston area, with Fletcher Webster, the son of famous U.S. Senator Daniel Webster, made its first colonel. In fact, they so identified with their colonel that they became known from then on as the Webster Regiment. They spent much of their early history on guard duty in Maryland until they joined the Army of the Potomac in the early part of 1862. The men of the 12th experienced combat for the very first time on the 18th of April in a minor skirmish while on picket duty along the Rappahannock River. They were assigned to the 3rd Corps of the newly formed Army of Virginia, and it was with the 3rd Corps that they would really first see a true battle. On August the 9th, they arrived late to the Battle of Cedar Mountain, but suffered 11 casualties from artillery fire there. A few weeks later, the 12th fought at the Second Battle of Bull Run, where they suffered 138 casualties. Among the dead that day was Colonel Webster, who fell in leading the defense of Chin Ridge with the regiment. After the Second Battle of Bull Run, there was some reorganization to the armies operating in the Eastern Theater, and the 12th Massachusetts was assigned to the 1st Corps under Joseph Hooker. Pretty soon they were back in Maryland, but this time not on guard duty, rather in pursuit of Lee's army, which had invaded the North for the first time. They were briefly engaged at South Mountain and then came here, where they were destined to suffer a higher casualty rate than any of the nearly 200 regiments in the Union Army at the Battle of Antietam. The night of the 16th was an uneasy one for the men. The soldiers slept with everything on them, ready for battle a moment's notice. There was sporadic shooting between pickets and constant movement by artillery and infantry. The men got little to no sleep that night as they bivouacked along the Smoketown Road. On the morning of September 17th, the 334 officers and men of the 12th Massachusetts rose before dawn to the sounds of the opening artillery duel that preceded the first attack. The 1st Corps was selected to begin the attack on the extreme right of the Union line. Doubleday's division on the right, Meade's division in the center, and Ricketts' division on the left. Hartsuff's brigade, which included the 12th Massachusetts, belonged to Ricketts' division and was intended to be in the first wave alongside a brigade under Duryea. They lined up with the 83rd New York on the left, the 13th Massachusetts next, then the 11th Pennsylvania, and the 12th Massachusetts to the right of the brigade. Now keep in mind, this is just 3 weeks after the Second Battle of Bull Run. This brigade lost 700 men in that battle. They haven't even had a chance to recover from that fight, and now they find themselves at the center of some of the deadliest action in the history of American warfare. The two brigades began side by side, but soon after they started, Hartsuff stopped his men because he wanted to go out and reconnoiter the ground a little bit in front of him. I'm walking now along a 1.6 mile trail that allows you to actually follow in the footsteps of the 1st Corps attack that morning. I'm facing south currently, which is the direction of the attack. So if I turn around over here, you can see the cornfield just maybe 100, 150 yards in that direction. So where I'm walking at the moment is right along the path. There's a road just on this side of me here. I believe it's Mansfield Road. And so I'm walking pretty near to where the 12th Massachusetts would have been advancing on that morning. It's a great place to get a real ground level look at the terrain, at the ups and downs, because the terrain here is fascinating. There's little rolling hills and ridges, and so there's places on the battlefield where, as you're marching through the cornfield, you would be pretty well protected from enemy fire, except for artillery, of course, but small arms fire, certainly. But then you will come up to certain places where you'll suddenly be in view and then dip down again. So that explains why some regiments suffered horribly, and maybe the regiment right next to them suffered far fewer casualties, because that's how quickly the terrain changes here. As he was reconnoitering the position, Hartsuff was wounded in the hip. He initially tried to continue to do his duty. He stayed on his horse, but very soon the loss of blood forced him to the ground. Suddenly the brigade was without its commander, and it stopped. While it stopped, the brigade of Duryea, who it was supposed to be attacking alongside, continued its attack here into the cornfield. Without support on its flank, Duryea's brigade was destroyed in its attack. It took about a half hour before the brigade under Hartsuff was able to get up and moving again, this time under Colonel Richard Coulter of the 11th Pennsylvania. By this point, they were moving into the cornfield behind Duryea's brigade, almost like a second wave of the attack. I'm standing now in the east-west portion of the cornfield trail. That would be east that we're looking right now, and the left wing of the brigade would have been going through those woods. while the right wing of the brigade, which included the 12th Massachusetts, would have been here, coming through the cornfield. I'm in the middle of the cornfield now. You can see the corn, how high it is. It's a couple of feet higher than I am, and I'm nearly 6 feet tall, so that gives you a sense of how tall it was. You can see just nothing right now. So the brigade, each regiment of the 4 regiments in the brigade sent forward 2 companies as skirmishers, and so the skirmishers would have been out front. When they got to this rail fence, it slowed them down. And though you can't really see it from here, there was artillery on the high ground, just on the other side of this cornfield. And that artillery under Stephen Dill Lee began to just tear huge holes in the regiment. Major Sidney Burbank, who was in command of the regiment as it marched through this cornfield, fell mortally wounded early in the fight. The 2 regiments on the right here in the cornfield actually had an easier time getting into position for the attack than the ones that were in the woods to the left, and so they were out front and so suffered the brunt of the artillery fire. But you can see here this high ground in front of us. That high ground, of course, as I mentioned before, meant that you were a more conspicuous target. The rebel skirmishers were on this high ground, and as the Union lines pushed forward, they very quickly were able to drive off those skirmishers. But then as they come up to this rise, they come under small arms fire. Confederate defensive line was here on the southern end of the cornfield. By the time the 12th Massachusetts got into line to be able to start firing volleys, they were facing the Louisianans of Harry Hayes. They unloaded a couple of volleys. Hayes' Louisianans fired volleys in return. It was close fighting. They never got to the place where it was hand to hand, but it was close enough that a volley was absolutely just as deadly as it can be. But they continued to fire. They continued to fight. Eventually, they were actually able to drive the Louisianans back, but reinforcements came up for the Confederates, and soon they found themselves, the 12th did, facing off against the 1st Texas, who would go on to be the Confederate regiment that suffered the highest casualty rate here at the Battle of Antietam. Eventually, the 12th, they've now lost their commander, Major Burbank. They've lost a great deal of men, but they continue to fight until they run low on ammunition. And they were forced to fall back. The 90th Pennsylvania moved up into their position and allowed the 12th to fall back. The fighting that day in the cornfield was confused, and it was awful. And it was over for the most part in less than a half hour. When all was said and done, Hartsuff's brigade was taken to the rear. They were refit, and around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they called the roll to see how many effectives they had among the 4 regiments who had gone into combat that morning. It was just under 300 who remained of the men who had gone into fighting. For the 12th Massachusetts, if you look at the casualty figures, you'll find that they are listed as having suffered somewhere around 65% casualties in their fighting.
But that doesn't tell the whole story, even though that number already makes them the unit that suffered the highest casualty rate of any in the Union Army that day. You see, one of their companies had actually been held back on headquarters duty and was not engaged in the fighting. And so out of the men who actually went forward into the cornfield, who actually attacked the Confederates that day, the number of casualties was actually closer to about 80% of the men who fought. They were able to walk out of the cornfield with their colors with something around 35 to 40 men able to bear arms. Of the men who were killed that day or died of their wounds, most of them are buried here in the Antietam National Cemetery. In the years following the American Civil War, many of the men who fought formed fraternal organizations such as the Grand Army of the Republic to remember and to get together. They had local posts, much like today there's the VFW or the Foreign Legion. Those men began to raise money to place monuments to their regiments at battlefields of note. Most of those monuments for individual regiments ended up at Gettysburg. There are some here at Antietam. States also did the same. They would place state monuments in honor of all of their men who fought. And in the Eastern Theater, most of those state monuments were placed at the Gettysburg battlefield, but not Massachusetts. Their state monument is here on the southern edge of the cornfield, near where so many of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts brave men gave their last full measure of devotion. I make no secret of the fact that my favorite Civil War movie of all time is Glory. The opening battle scenes in that film portray an attack by members of the 2nd Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry through the cornfield here at Antietam in September of 1862. Now, granted, there's no corn in Glory, but that's where they attacked historically. Specifically, we get to see the battle through the eyes of a young company commander, Robert Gould Shaw. Now, we don't get very much in the way of information about exactly where they're fighting or what happened. So I thought it might be interesting to take a little bit of time to share the story of Robert Gould Shaw and his fellow members of the 2nd Massachusetts here at the Battle of Antietam. Robert Gould Shaw was born to a family of prominent Massachusetts abolitionists, but he spent much of his early life studying in New York City and then in Europe. Quite a life, huh? He expressed an interest in going to West Point, but his parents never took him all that seriously because Robert seemed to have a real aversion to submitting to authority in his life. In 1856, when he was 18 years old, Robert returned home from Europe and enrolled at Harvard. He attended Harvard for 3 years, but he dropped out before graduating and went back to New York, to Staten Island, where he worked at his uncle's mercantile firm. By all accounts, it seems that this young Robert Gould Shaw really struggled to find purpose. He struggled to feel at home in anything that he did. But that all changed in 1861. In 1861, the American Civil War broke out, and Robert Gould Shaw found his calling. Abraham Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days to help put down the rebellion. Obviously, we know in hindsight how incredibly naive and optimistic those numbers are, because it would take far more men for far longer to make it happen. But Robert Gould Shaw enlisted as a private in the 7th New York Militia. The men got their weapons, they got their uniforms, they marched down Broadway in lower Manhattan to the cheering crowds. They went to Washington, where they really just did nothing. The unit was dissolved when their 90 days were up, but Robert had found what he wanted to do. He received a commission in the 2nd Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry as a 2nd lieutenant in Company H, where he served proudly through a number of conflicts. The unit ended up losing 35% of their men at the Battle of Cedar Mountain, and then they came here to the Battle of Antietam, where they were attached to Joseph Mansfield's 12th Corps, which would be the 2nd Corps to launch an attack on the morning of the 17th. So we're here on the Miller Farm. I'm right on the north end of the cornfield. This is the cornfield. We're looking toward the south. This is the Hagerstown Pike right here. And it was actually right on this spot, on this corner of the cornfield along the pike, where the 2nd Massachusetts was initially placed into line. And they were not initially involved in the fighting. They were placed here kind of in a reserve position, as other units ahead of them were still fighting, but they were going to get their chance. Now, no sooner had the 2nd moved into their position here on the corner of the cornfield and the pike than Confederates appeared coming through the cornfield, and they had to open fire. Now, by this point, the cornfield had already changed hands multiple times. The Union had attacked, the Confederates had counterattacked, and back and forth it went. Multiple waves, multiple units had attacked. The bodies were piling up. It was already an absolute bloodbath in this place by the time the 12th Corps even moved into position to continue the fighting. At some point, they drove off the Confederates yet again, and the men of the 2nd, along with the 13th New Jersey, began to move down in the direction of the Confederate lines to the south of here. So Robert Gould Shaw was describing what he saw in this open field, which is to the south of the cornfield. It's called the clover field. He was describing the carnage that he saw in this location, and this is what he wrote. He said, beyond the cornfield was a large open field, and such a mass of dead and wounded men, mostly rebels, as were lying there I never saw before. It was a terrible sight, and our men had to be careful to avoid treading on them. Many were mangled and torn to bits by artillery, but mostly infantry fire. After their counterattack allowed them to push through to the southern end of the cornfield, the fighting was starting to shift over toward the woods on this side, what are known as the West Woods. And so because of that shift in the fighting, the 2nd actually shifted their orientation from facing south to then facing to the west. And so the combat at this point then was an east-west fight. And once again, it was a pushback. It was a give and take as the lines moved. And eventually, like so many other units on both sides that day, the men of the 2nd Massachusetts were forced to fall back to a line at the East Woods, but not before the loss of their lieutenant colonel, who was beloved by the men, a man named Wilder Dwight. And the spot where he fell is marked today by the Massachusetts Monument. After the Battle of Antietam, Shaw remained with his company. They went down to Fredericksburg, where the Union Army lost a disastrous defeat in December of 1862. The 2nd was at Fredericksburg, but they didn't participate in the fighting there. It was while they were still at Fredericksburg that Governor John Andrew of Massachusetts had a conversation with Shaw's father, expressing an interest in Robert for potential command of a new regiment that was being formed. Robert was eventually offered command of the Black 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, which he accepted. It was the first really kind of national black infantry unit. There were a couple of units that had been formed here and there, but the 54th was really more than a Massachusetts regiment. There were men from all over the country who flocked to Massachusetts when they heard that the regiment was being formed. So many that they ended up actually forming a 55th Massachusetts because of all the men who were willing to volunteer. Eventually there were over 200,000 black soldiers, and Abraham Lincoln credited them with helping turn the tide of the war. It wouldn't have been possible, though, without men like Robert Gould Shaw and the men of the 54th who paved the way for so many others. I won't share The rest of that story, you probably know it if you don't watch the film Glory. Shaw was still a very young man when he fell on the parapet of Battery Wagner, leading his men in the famous attack there. He was buried in a burial trench with his soldiers. Robert Gould Shaw's father said that there could be no better place for him to be than amongst the men that he loved so much and the unit that he loved so much. The Union attack on the morning of September 17th was an echelon attack, moving from right to left. It began early in the morning with Hooker's 1st Corps attack on the far right of the Union line. Next came Mansfield's 12th Corps. And then finally, the attack by Major General Edwin Sumner's 2nd Corps. Sumner had 3 divisions under his command. In the lead was John Sedgwick, whose division veered off to the west and attacked into the West Woods. Now, there's a great deal of confusion to this day about what Sumner's intentions with his corps were and whether or not the other divisions attacked as they were intended. It seems as though the division of Brigadier General William French was supposed to follow in support of Sedgwick, but that's not what happened. It was one of the many times on this battlefield that there seems to have been a real breakdown in command and control, especially on the Union side. Sumner's other 2 divisions ended up instead turning toward the south, toward an area known to the locals as the Sunken Road. That's where I'm standing now. By the end of the day, it would forever be known as Bloody Lane. Defending the Sunken Lane that day was a division under D.H. Hill, men from Alabama on the left and men from North Carolina on the right. Really, the battle here in and of itself could be a series of videos, but there's a lot to cover, and so I'm sharing with you the Union perspective, and my friend JD from the History Underground is going to give you the Confederate perspective. So I'll put a link in the description. Check out his channel for all of the amazing content from the Antietam battlefield, but especially to get the perspective of what was happening on the Confederate side here at the Bloody Lane. French's attack came in 3 waves, with the German-born Brigadier General Max Weber's brigade in the lead, followed by the brigades of Colonel Dwight Morris and Brigadier General Nathan Kimball. Now, it's important to note that of the 10 regiments in French's division, only 3 had any previous battle experience. A few of them had just joined the army within the last few weeks. They were still learning to load their rifles, learning to march in order. Weber's brigade, from left to right, was the 1st Delaware, the 5th Maryland, and the 4th New York. They waded through waist-deep water and crossing the Antietam Creek at around 7:30 a.m., but it was nearly 9 o'clock before they were in position to launch the attack. Part of that delay was caused by a lack of ammunition. You see, the men of the 5th Maryland carried Austrian Lorenz rifles, which were of a different caliber than the weapons carried by the other regiments of the brigade. And so there was a holdup while they found the proper ammunition. Eventually, each man was issued 80 rounds of ammunition, and the brigade moved forward. Weber ordered the color bearer of the 5th Maryland, who was described as a heavy-built German man of over 6 feet and weighing nearly 300 pounds. He ordered him to aim for the William Roulette home and guide the men in that direction. So I want to give you a sense of what this attack was like from the Union perspective. We are about 120 yards from the sunken lane. You can't see it at all. You can barely see the top of a monument there on the hill to members of the Maryland regiment that attacked here. But as we come around this corner, we're going to start walking toward the sunken lane up this hill. This is what the men of the Union would have seen. Keep in mind, though, they're not under any small arms fire at this point. They are under Confederate artillery fire, which is already inflicting some casualties. But at this point, they're very near to the sunken lane, and you still can't see anything. You're starting now to see the very top of the Alabamians' line, but just a small part of it. Certainly wouldn't have been able to return fire from here. But it's only when we get up to this monument that you're finally in position to start firing on the Confederates, who are in basically a makeshift trench. And as they came up over this hill, Rhodes's men would have unleashed hell on the men of Maryland. Now, Weber's brigade, though it was the lead brigade in a 3-pronged attack by French, the other brigades began to shift a little further to the east. And so there was a bit of overlap, but Weber's brigade would have extended down the hill in this direction. And then you would have had the other 2 brigades of French's division coming in, kind of overlapping maybe a third, but moving in further and further down at the sunken lane from this direction, but likewise cresting a hill on that side where there's a cornfield today, and just coming under murderous fire as soon as they got to the top of that hill. This spot at the crest of the hill is as far as the leading waves of the Union infantry got. Next, it was going to be up to Israel Richardson and his division, which would be coming in behind, but also a bit further to the left of French's men. This field in front of me might be the very best spot in order to understand and visualize the Union attack on Bloody Lane. To my left down this road is the Mumma farm, the Roulette farm
is right there. And now in this field in front of me, you can see we're basically looking down the long axis of the Union advance. So just in this field right here in front of me would have been where French's division was marching across. It's a nice wide open field. I don't believe these trees were here at the time. It was all open all the way to the sunken lane, which you can just see in the distance. You can see the fence there for what we know as Bloody Lane. In the far field then would have been an hour later where Richardson's division would have come in. And so you can just imagine this massive blue, 5,000 men from the 1st Division coming through right here, the other division then coming through later, another 5,000 men. Just keeping them organized under intense artillery fire would have been difficult because these are men, most of them brand new recruits. Many of them only have been in the Army a couple of weeks. They're still learning how to do this stuff, and they've got to do it in open field, under fire, attacking one of the strongest defensive positions on the battlefield. As French's division was launching their attack on the Bloody Lane, his follow-up attack under command of Israel Richardson was just fording the Antietam Creek and moving into position. As French began to fall back and he was trying to hang on and hold the Confederates' attention, Richardson's attack commenced here on the right side of the Confederate line at the Bloody Lane. The attack came in the form of Thomas Maher's Irish Brigade. It wasn't completely Irish. It was made up of 3 New York City regiments that were Irish. Also a 29th Massachusetts, which probably had some Irish, but wasn't distinctly Irish like the other units were. That brigade would go on to experience some of the worst fighting on the worst battlefields at places like Marye's Heights, at Fredericksburg, and in the wheat field at Gettysburg. But on this day, they attacked in force and got within about 30 yards of the Confederate line where volleys were being exchanged. But eventually, like many of the other units, they just weren't able to push through. Eventually, Caldwell's brigade came up to relieve them when they got low on ammunition. Initially, Caldwell's brigade, which was following behind the brigade of Thomas Maher, was coming around on the far left of Richardson's division, and they were going to put enfilading fire into Anderson's division here at Bloody Lane. But they eventually found themselves shifting further back and actually coming in behind Maher's brigade. There were, however, elements of Caldwell's brigade that did start to fire into the Confederates down the long axis of Bloody Lane. And there was one soldier in Caldwell's brigade that described how devastating their fire was on the Confederates. He said that it was really hard to miss at that distance and with so many soldiers. I mean, when you're firing into the flanks, if you miss the first guy, you might hit the second or the third. And he even described how some of the bullets would hit the side of the lane and ricochet into a soldier, and that soldier would go down.
Eventually, as JD, I'm sure, will explain in his video from the Confederate perspective, something happened. And of course, the Union didn't know exactly what had happened, but something happened, and the Confederates, who had been holding their position until then, suddenly started to fall back and abandoned their positions on the Bloody Lane. They moved back over the next hillside onto the Piper farm, but they did manage to reform and launch a counterattack, but they were never again able to retake the position here at the Bloody Lane. In the aftermath, some of the most horrific scenes of the American Civil War were photographed. Due to the proximity to Washington, D.C., there were a number of photographers who came here to the battlefield in the days afterwards. And by the time they arrived, quite a bit of the Union dead had been buried, but many of the Confederates remained where they were killed. And that included here in the Bloody Lane. And won't include those photographs in this particular episode. I have a later episode where we'll talk more about the aftermath of the battle. But you can see the carnage here. You can see the heaps of Confederate bodies lying in this place where they fell. Gives you a sense, a little sense of what happened here, but we can never, I think, fully grasp just how horrific this place must have been on September 17th, 1862. Behind me is one of the most unique monuments on the Antietam battlefield. It's one of the largest ones here, but it's not a memorial to a general. It's not for a state or for a regiment. It's in honor of a commissary sergeant from the 23rd Ohio who never fired a shot at this battle. But before I tell you his story, I want to back up. The history of the 23rd Ohio Infantry is a fascinating one. Antietam was the only major battle in which it fought. But there are few units who can boast such a storied history among its members after the war. The regiment was organized in June of 1861 at Camp Chase in Columbus. Future General William Stark Rosecrans was its first colonel and commanding officer. It spent much of the early part of the war in what today is West Virginia as part of the Kanawha Brigade. By 1862, they had come further east as part of the 9th Corps, and they were engaged at South Mountain, where their new colonel was wounded. The 23rd then came here to Antietam, where it fought on the south end of the battlefield before returning to West Virginia. They would later fight in Sheridan's 1864 Shenandoah Valley campaign before being mustered out in 1865. It's what happened after the war with some of the former members of this unit that's most interesting. Stanley Matthews, who served as lieutenant colonel of the regiment, went on to serve as a United States Senator and then an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Robert Patterson Kennedy began his service as a first lieutenant in the 23rd and would go on to serve in Congress and as lieutenant governor of the state of Ohio. Harrison Gray Otis rose from a private in the 12th Ohio to eventually become lieutenant colonel in the 23rd. After the war, he became the owner of the newspaper that we know today as the Los Angeles Times. There were other notables as well, but there are two more that I guess I should probably bring up. Because two members of the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry went on to become president of the United States. You remember a moment ago I talked about their commanding officer who was wounded at South Mountain just before Antietam. That was Lieutenant Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes, who would go on to serve in the Congress, was twice elected governor of Ohio, and then finally became the 19th president of the United States. That leaves one more person we haven't talked about, the commissary sergeant. So that commissary sergeant, he had enlisted at the age of 18 as a private. He was a native of the town of Niles, Ohio, in the northeast part of the state. He had risen up to the point where he was a sergeant here at Antietam. He was the food guy. And he went around during the battle as the 23rd was under fire, making sure under fire that every member of the regiment had hot coffee and hot food. On a day like this, there weren't too many men who got hot coffee and hot food. And many of the men who were here remembered that. A week after the battle, he was given a battlefield commission, made a second lieutenant. He eventually made his way to the rank of captain and was even made a brevet major at the end of the war. Now, all of that probably would have gone unnoticed, and I doubt it would have warranted a monument of this size, except for the fact that that young man went on to serve as governor of Ohio and then was elected twice as president of the United States. His name was William McKinley. William McKinley was assassinated in Buffalo, New York in September of 1901. 2 years after he was killed, this monument was placed on the Antietam battlefield in his memory. So, interesting thing, as you're walking down to Burnside Bridge, which is down the hill from the McKinley Monument, there's another monument telling you where that monument is, just in case you didn't know. Just kind of an interesting thing. Really, you can tell they just really wanted to play up the fact that a future president had been here, even though he wasn't performing any great acts of heroism on a battlefield. Not to take anything away from what McKinley did that day, but I just thought that was kind of interesting. Hey everybody, it is my last day here on the Antietam battlefield, and I'm standing next to another mortuary cannon. I showed you one of those the other day, and I want to give you a little bit of a story behind this one. Now, Joseph Mansfield was the only corps commander on either side, and one of only a handful of corps commanders during the entire American Civil War to be killed in action. Mansfield had only been given command of the Union 12th Corps 2 days before the Battle of Antietam. It was his first field command as a general. He had served in the Mexican War, but he was at the time a much lower rank. And so he took command of the 12th Corps, and he was leading them into action on the morning of September 17th. They were the 2nd Corps to go into action. The Union attack basically moved from right to left. So you had Hooker's 1st Corps attacked first, followed by the 12th Corps of Mansfield. And Mansfield had come up to the front to encourage his men to move the attack on in, and then he had gone back to get some reinforcements before coming once again to the front in order to oversee the deployment of the troops. When he got back to this point, he saw the men of the 10th Maine firing into these woods. And he was sure that it was Hooker's men who were in those woods, and so he started riding up and down the line, shouting to the men of the 10th Maine, "No, you're firing into your own men. Stop, stop." But the men of the 10th Maine, they protested, and they said, "No, we've been here. We know who we're firing at. It's definitely the enemy." Mansfield then looked and said, "Okay, yes, you're right." And just as he said those words, a bullet slammed into his horse, and then a bullet slammed into his chest. He actually was able to ride his horse a little bit north on the Smoketown Road to try and get away from the men of the 10th Maine so that they didn't see him go down. But eventually he just was not able to stay up, and there were men from another regiment who helped him down from his horse. They called for a surgeon, but it was clear that he was mortally wounded. He was taken to a field hospital where he died the next day. He was posthumously promoted to the rank of Major General, and that promotion was backdated to July of 1862. And it was specifically mentioned that that promotion was because of his gallantry here on the morning of September 17th. So we are here at Burnside Bridge, and I just want to show you one of my favorite spots on this battlefield. And it's not the bridge, and it's not the place where the attack happened. It's right here on this side. And there's this photograph that you see where they show men from the Union who had been buried right here along here, and they even have some of the planks from the bridge itself, which you can still see up there today that were on the top. They've been restored, but some of those planks were taken off to make temporary grave markers. You can see, if you had the right resolution, you could actually see the names and the units of these men who are buried here right in this spot. It's just one of those real visceral reminders that men died here. Men died right here trying to cross this bridge, and they were initially buried within a few feet of where they fell, right along this spot. Hey everybody, I am just down the road a bit from Burnside Bridge, which you can kind of see right there. Kind of an obscure spot that's a little hard to get to. But what I want to show you here is the monument to the 11th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry, which is one of the harder ones to find here on the battlefield. Interesting story. You see in this the depiction of the men of the 11th Connecticut attacking from across the Burnside Bridge. Their colonel, Kingsbury, interesting story. He was mortally wounded in the attack at Burnside Bridge. But D.R. Jones was a major general on the Confederate side in command of the troops that he was attacking. And Kingsbury and Jones were married to sisters in the same family. Kingsbury was mortally wounded here at Antietam, and Jones, who was only in his 30s, died of a heart attack a few months later, and a lot of people attribute his death to the events that unfolded here at Antietam.